Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with Dr Noel Brick and Scott Douglas. Guys, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hello.
Hi Dan, thanks for having us on.
Great to have you both on. And Noel, welcome back. This is your second appearance, mate.
It's very strange, but an absolute privilege, Dan, to be back on. And again, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
No, well, your episode we did, was that about a year and a half ago now, was super popular. So back by popular demand, Noel, and also back to promote a new book that you've written with Scott. So really excited to talk about that with you guys today. But look, I think let's start by getting you to introduce yourselves to the Sports Psych Show audience. Scott, why don't you go first?
Sure. I'm Scott Douglas. I live in the United States. I am a longtime writer and editor, primarily in running, but increasingly in broader fitness and health topics. The Genius of Athletes is the 13th book that I've ever written or co-written. And Noel is the first non-Olympian with whom I've co-written a book. So he's going to need to use some of the techniques in the book to get his marathon time down by about an hour.
No pressure there. No, you'll be using all of your techniques, as you say, on yourself. Well, Noel, it's so great to have you back on. Why don't you reintroduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Thanks, Dan. So I'm a lecturer in sport and exercise psychology based in Ulster University in Ireland. So unlike Scott, this is the first book I've written, though I have published a lot of research on mostly on psychology of endurance activity, and particularly what sort of strategies endurance athletes use. But as Scott alluded to, somewhat less successfully with myself, and I clearly have a lot of work to do to get my time down to somewhere near as competitive as some of Scott's other co-authors and Scott himself.
Well, I think I'd have to drop my time by about an hour, so you're much closer than I am. But look, it's so cool to have you both on. We're here today to talk about your new book, The Genius of Athletes, what world-class competitors know that can change your life. So not just hitting a sporting audience, but hitting the general population, I suppose. The techniques that we talk about on a day-to-day basis, Noel, can influence people in their day-to-day lives, in the corporate world, in their day-to-day challenges. So such an interesting topic to talk about. I mean, let's just start before we dive into the book. How do you two know each other? How did this project get off the ground?
So I was aware of Noel's research. So one of sort of my normal gig is writing and editing for the Runner's World website. And so one of my sort of areas of focus there is always looking for interesting sports science research that has practical applications for our readers. And so in, I think, 2015, 2016, I became aware of Noel's work. For a previous book that I wrote about running and mental health, I used some of one bit of Noel's research in that book in one of the chapters. And after that book, that was sort of the book I always wanted to write. And after that book, I was sort of like, are there any more books that I want to write? Is there anything I'm really interested in writing about? And in the interim, Noel published some more research that I was aware of. And I found that this was something that really, really interested me on both a personal and professional level. All these sort of, here's how the best athletes think and how to use that in your own sporting performance. Certainly when I was at my best as a runner, 30 years ago, I would have benefited greatly from knowing more about this stuff at that time. So I started thinking, okay, I had an idea for this book, sort of, this toolkit of strategies. And I realized that I would basically be spending months interviewing Noel for the book and worrying that I was getting it all wrong. And so I asked if he would like to write the book with me. And he agreed, thankfully enough. And we put together a proposal for the publisher of the previous book that I talked about, and they liked it, and that was that. And off we went. And so Noel actually has been to the house in which I'm sitting right now. Would be September of 2019. And he and his wife Holly were vacationing up in Canada, and I'm in Maine, so they just came down real quick into Maine and spent the night here. And we even spent maybe 10 minutes talking about the book during during a really nice 2-day visit. So that's the basic backstory.
And that was your entry into the world of becoming an author, Noel.
It was, and I think on the flip side for me, one thing I was very aware of, when we started to develop the idea for this book, and actually even before that, one of my kind of barriers, I guess, to writing a book like this was I felt that. So I guess I knew I had a good knowledge of the strategies, the tools, techniques that these elite athletes used, but switching from an academic mode of writing, which can be very, I'm trying not to use the word boring here, but I guess, it's a very different style of writing to the type of book that ultimately we've produced here. So I think when Scott and I had a conversation, and one of the points in that conversation was, why do you want to write this book with me? For me, the reason was I was aware of Scott's writing. I was aware of Running Is My Therapy and some of the other books that he's written. And I knew how good a writer he was, a storyteller he was. And so I think it was a nice coming together of the kind of academic style, which if anybody wants to read some of the earlier drafts of some of the chapters in this book, they will forever stay on my computer, because I think at a point I kind of reflected and I kind of thought, who would really outside the academic world want to have read this chapter as it was in its first draft? So I think it was a good coming together of both of our abilities to hopefully produce a book that is evidence-based, but also interesting for most people to read and to take something from.
We could possibly substitute the word boring for complicated, Noel?
Complicated, nuanced, yeah.
Nuanced.
Yeah, absolutely nuanced. Again, just before, something you mentioned, Scott, sparked an interest for me. You've been running for a long time now, 30 odd years, and you've obviously written a book about running and mental health. Running Is My Therapy, I think it's called, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But in terms of running and performance psychology, or performance psychology within running, I mean, you've mentioned that, wow, I could have used the techniques that we've written about in this book 30 years ago, but when did...
Yes.
For you, having been running yourself, running to a high level, being around the world's best runners for such a long time, when did performance psychology come onto your radar?
I would say in a really strong way, starting after I wrote 2 books with Meb Keflezighi, who he's the American who won the Boston Marathon the year after the bombing. And so we wrote 2 books together, and it was really while writing those books with Meb that I realized how powerful these tools are, because he's no more gifted than anybody who he competed against. He didn't train any harder. He certainly trained very hard, but it's not like he would ran 200 miles a week while they were running 100 miles a week. His mind was the difference between being the person who was ranked 18th, on race, had the 18th best PR on the day, and who finished first, second, or third. And so I really, and so when we would talk, Meb and I would talk, he always wanted to talk about all the I do a tempo run. I increasingly want to talk about yeah, but everybody does tempo runs. What do you do? How are you differently in this other area? So when we started working on that book in 2014, that's when the stuff really started to as sort of a whole separate thing that everybody could spend time on, could benefit spending time on, in the same way that they could benefit spending time on running form drills, or benefit from spending time on better nutrition. It really hit me that this whole other area that is sort of undeveloped, especially in everyday athletes, could be very it's personally very interesting to me and very useful toward the people who I tend to be writing for, which are sort of everyday, ambitious athletes.
And sorry to labour my questions here, but I just think it's a fascinating landscape. Scott, would you say, when you reflect back, running in the 80s, running in the 90s, that perhaps performance psychology suffered a little bit from, well, we don't have problems here, that's not to do with us, that can't help
Yes,
us? Would that
right.
very much have been the landscape back then?
Well, I barely even rose to that level, right? It wasn't even, it was just sort of like, are you tough enough? Sort of stuff, or like, how bad do you want it?
Yeah.
I mean, from the only time that really back, I'd say in the 90s or whatever, that at least in my world,
Yeah.
that I would hear about sports psychology was sort of if somebody was an elite athlete was severely underperforming. And we actually have a story from one of those people in the book, Steve Holman, who was the top American miler of
Yeah.
the 1990s,
Yeah.
but who had a history of coming up short in national championships when he should have been well ahead of all these guys, because he was ranked fourth and fifth in the world at one point. But we heard about Steve Holman seeing a sports psychologist because of his quote problems. But back then you didn't hear that, everybody could benefit from this work, in the same way that now all elite runners, you hear about getting massage, chiropractic, etc., not just the ones who were broken, right? And in the 90s, that sort of wasn't analogous to sports psychology. It was much more just like, oh, so and so has a problem, so and so is coming up short, she or he is going to seek sports psychology help, but not like as a basic part of training. Another person whose story we have in the book is Keegan Randall, who was an Olympic gold medal Nordic skier. And she talks about how when she was first brought to the sort of national training camp, the sports psychology, tools were offered to like the young recruits, but not mandatory. And you would never say like, if you feel like doing intervals, that's fine, but you don't have to, right? So I think there's still an element of like, oh, this is not an integral part of how to be a top performer. It's, it'd be good if you did it, sort of stuff. When there's so many other things that are now just taken as givens that if you want to be a top performer, you do all these other things other than just the physical training.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, Noel? Because whilst psychological training has grown in popularity, and I think the vast majority of certainly elite level runners and performers see the importance of it, we're still salesmen to a degree, aren't we? No, we're still trying to sell our wares across sport. Would you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I would, and I agree. And I suppose that, it's maybe different in different contexts, but certainly, where I am in Ireland and the sports both that I research in, which is predominantly endurance activities, and Gaelic games where I kind of practice as well. It very much is that, I'm even thinking of a conversation that I had with an athlete this week where we were still talking about, maybe the stigma that might be associated with working with a sports psychologist. And I think Scott's analogy there was great about this idea that it's something that you might do if you're broken, rather than maybe in inverted commas, rather than maybe a more positive psychology approach where actually it's about, these things that help you reach an optimal level of if we're just looking through a performance lens, an optimal level of performance. So I think you're right in that, it's still about the stories a little bit. That does help. I think in Gaelic games, where I come from, there's also a sense sometimes that if one team is using it and they're successful, be it strength and conditioning, be it massage, be it sports psychology, that's really when it sort of maybe captures people's attention, and it might become something that a player, an athlete, or a team might consider using. But I still feel we have a certain way to go to reach a point where it's considered the norm in activities.
Well, it's books like yours that will help ease that passageway, and to talk about your book, to introduce your book, The Genius of Athletes. It's split into two parts. Part one introducing the reader to 5 basic mental skills or mental techniques that are essential for anybody interested in developing in sport, in their life, in high performance. And then part 2, so you kind of set the scene in part 1 in many respects, and then in part 2 you continue to introduce these techniques through stories and through other philosophies and approaches, and really bring these techniques and bring performance psychology to life. It's such a fantastic read, guys. And I think what we'll do in this episode is we'll certainly talk about each of the techniques and bring these techniques to life where we can with some stories of elite athletes who have utilized them. Part 1 starts with the technique. Unsurprisingly, it starts with goal setting, and just straight away, one bit of information hit me, Noel, which I hadn't really thought about, and that's that we're wired for long-term goal chasing, which I just think is fascinating. I get that we're wired, we're sort of goal-oriented machines, if you like, but we're really wired to look into the future and strive to chase certain goals to accomplish certain tasks, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think part of this comes from somebody who Scott interviewed as part of this book as well. So this idea of our substitute chases and substitute chases from, I guess, what we maybe from a certain lens evolved to do, which was, as hunter gatherers to chase prey, and this idea of kind of that was kind of the goals that we evolved to pursue. Obviously not so much anymore, but we're still very much goal oriented, I guess, in terms of a lot of, in a sporting context, in terms of a lot of what we do.
And I suppose back in the times of hunter gatherers, there was one type of goal. Let's go and get some food, basically. Whereas what we know now from research is we can really break down our goals, can't we? In simple terms, there's 3 types of goals. Would that be right, Noel?
Yeah, so I think just kind of starting with I suppose what we might consider a basic understanding of goal setting, and those 3 types of goals: outcome-oriented goals, performance goals, and process goals. Just to give a bit of a background, I think we begin this chapter just with a brief overview of those 3 different types of goals. I mentioned earlier some of the drafts that will forever stay on my hard drive, and I think one kind of reflection that we had early in this book was that, after writing a first draft which went into quite a bit of detail on outcome goals, performance goals, process goals, a reflection that we had was, what people know how to set goals. People kind of set goals, without really much insight maybe from us. Although I guess, and I know this has been discussed, I'm sure, in the show before, there are certain advantages and disadvantages of maybe focusing on outcome goals versus performance goals versus process goals. But I think for me, one of the real interesting things that we dive into in this chapter about goal setting is actually some of the recent research that for me has taken a lot of what we thought we knew about goal setting, which is this idea of kind of SMART goals, specific, measurable, etc. And actually suggested that those goals aren't helpful in all situations, and there can actually be situations where non-specific goals are helpful. And an area of research which I've been fascinated by, really, I guess, over the last 4 years since one of the first publications was done this, led by a researcher called Christian Swan, is this idea of open goals or non-specific goals, and how goals, rather than saying, if it's a performance goal where we might say, we've been speaking about marathon running, so I might set myself a specific target of running a mile in 8 minutes, or running a marathon in less than 3 hours, whatever it might be. The idea of an open goal is that I pretty much see how fast I can go, so I maybe focus on the process of running, but my goal is to see how well I can do, to see how fast I can go. And what research has suggested, and the sort of research we discuss in this first chapter of the book, is the idea that actually goal setting, especially for somebody who's a beginner in an area, setting open goals can be much more helpful in terms of maybe achieving a similar level of performance, but actually feeling for beginners less pressurized in comparison with a specific goal, and also more enjoyable in comparison with setting a specific goal. So that's one area that really captured my attention, I think, when we were doing a bit of research from this book, and we kind of wanted to introduce maybe some of the nuance about goal setting and some of the recent research about goal setting to suggest that maybe what we thought we knew about goal setting isn't true in all cases, perhaps.
I think it's fascinating. I'm so pleased you took us down this path, Noel, because I think that was the part of the chapter that really hit home. You read a lot of chapters about goal setting, and they tend to be same. And as you say, they tend to go down that path of smarter. And it's I'm not going to say it's never resonated with me, that notion of smarter goal setting and knowing what outcome goal you want in the future. But I've often found, whether it's through my own personal experience or just working with clients, that actually deciding what it is you absolutely want either hasn't been something that somebody's able to do, or it's, as you've mentioned there, it actually stresses them out, and it can feel quite counterintuitive at times. Whereas if we say, well, look, how fast can I run? If we're talking about running, or what position can I attain in this company, or what score can I shoot, or where can we finish on, in a league table, perhaps, that can be quite useful. But for clarity there, can we still have, let's say, process goals or task goals, mini goals that take us towards a high performance, towards an open goal as such? Are you still saying that that's still applicable?
Absolutely, and it does. I guess, depends on maybe the context, and I think it also depends on the individual insofar as maybe their level of expertise in a situation. So one of the nuances that comes out of that research in a 2020 study that was done at the University of Lincoln was they showed that for a very simple walking task, like a 6-minute walking task, that people who were considered beginners, so people who are not regularly physically active, those individuals found the open goal more enjoyable, felt less pressurized when setting an open goal, but the key bit was reached a same or similar level of performance as they did in a specific goal or do your best goal. However, people who were regularly physically active actually preferred the SMART goal. They preferred a target. They preferred a performance target. And I think those other things, just as an aside, those other things are really important as well. Maybe the process goals. So again, if we meet a challenge during an activity, how am I going to respond to that challenge? What am I going to think about? What am I going to do? Those processes that might help us perform at our best in a task. Those type of goals are still really important. But I think one other thing that I think is really interesting with the open goals that we're considering as well, from maybe a more longer term developmental type perspective, is how we might perceive a level of performance based on the type of goal that we set. And if I kind of shift it outside the sporting field for a second to maybe more exercise psychology, but the application to sport would be relevant, but this is where the research kind of lies, is that, let's say we all know the target, for example, of achieving 1,000 steps per day as in terms of physical activity, which is a specific measurable target. So that's our traditional SMART goal. If I'm learning to become more physically active, I'm going from 0 to trying to get to 10,000, and let's say on a day I achieve 6,000 steps. If I had that SMART goal of 10,000 steps, I might look at my 6,000 steps and think, wow, I tried really hard, so my processes, but I didn't succeed, I failed. That was actually really poor. So again, we might think about the implications of that for, would I like to continue the activity? How do I feel about the activity? Did I actually perceive my level of performance in a positive or a negative way? Whereas if I set an open goal about the process of getting more physically active and I achieve the same 6,000 steps, I might look at that same objective result and think, wow, I did really well. I went from 0 to 6,000 in one day. So I think that the longer term implications there of how we view our performance, and you can bring it maybe back into the sporting field from there, how somebody who's maybe learning, be it a new technique or we're trying to maybe adapt or change some aspect of performance, learn a new skill or whatever, the research would suggest that setting an open goal for a beginner in that context may be more helpful to help their performance and how they actually view the level of performance that they achieve as well.
Scott, you must have heard of some big audacious goals that athletes have set themselves over the years.
Yeah, well, so I mentioned one of my other co-authors, Meb Keflezighi, and he is a great example of that. He set at the beginning of his career the goal to win an Olympic medal in the marathon and win the Boston and New York City marathons. And he did all those things. Before, it took him, it was 10 years between winning the Olympic silver medal and winning the Boston Marathon, so to sort of complete his trifecta. To me, I mean, one of the things that's striking to me is this long-term motivator that having those goals provided to him. He had several times in his career where it would have been, nobody would have said, "Oh, you're quitting too early." Where if he had retired, people would have said, "What a great career." But those long-term goals kept him motivated through, into his late 30s. So he was running at a world-class level for 15 years, more than 15 years. That's one of the examples I think of like, it's just what seemed to me like audacious goals. And I've asked him. Actually, I did a panel with him and Dina Castor, who's has the U.S. women's marathon record. And in the 2004 U.S. Olympic trials, both were second, and then they both medaled at the 2000 Olympics in the marathon. And I like moderated a panel with them once, and I was like, so I don't think most of us, after finishing second in the country, would then think, "Well, I can be top 3 in the world," But their goals were set such that they could. It was this bounce of audaciousness, but what's realistically possible. So to Noel's point, I think that for them, these sort of more specific goals were very motivating, and in certainly in Meb's case for a decade and a half. That to me is something that I think is. I don't know if most people have something that motivating, right? To me, that's always like when I try to set a goal for myself, I always think, is that really motivating to me, or am I just doing that because that's what I should be doing? And so, in the case of Matt Keflezighi, he definitely found that goal that was so personally meaningful that it kept him going for, a decade and a half.
Absolutely fascinating, and just briefly, Noel, I mean, before we move on to the next technique, it feels like what you're both saying has repercussions for coaches, not just for sports psychs who might be sitting down with a player and helping them set goals, but for coaches as well, in terms of what conversations coaches have with the people that they're coaching. Do they help people, players, athletes set open goals or more specific goals that Scott was talking about there? There are options. We've moved on from, well, let's just make the specifics. Genuinely, some people might prefer open, others might prefer specific.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the nuance that's coming out of some of this research. And I think, I suppose, to go back to the point about that you made earlier about outcome, performance, process goals, etc. I think certainly the kind of long-term research in this would suggest that they're all maybe part of the mix. They're all important as part of that mix. And Scott was talking about those outcome goals of winning Olympics, of winning Boston, of winning New York, and how motivating those can be. But I guess then also with my sports psych head, I kind of think of during performance how sometimes those goals might be anxiety provoking, and so maybe focusing on a more process oriented goal or a more performance oriented goal, process oriented goal. And I think where then the nice bit on open goals comes in there is that can be part of the mix, depending on the context, depending on the individual. That's setting a goal that doesn't necessarily go with the traditional SMART, but actually more so can be focused on, I'm going to focus on the on the process of running as fast as I can and see how well I can do. See how high I can come in the Olympics or whatever the context might be.
Fascinating stuff. Chapter 2. Emotional regulation. Actually, within this chapter, no, you've mentioned that there are 160 distinct strategies to change how we feel. So I think my first question for you here is, how did you approach this chapter? Because there's so many different ways to approach emotional regulation, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's coming from some research. I think that was a review paper by Parkinson and Totterdell in the 90s, I think, maybe early 2000s, when they created this taxonomy of different strategies that we use to regulate our emotions. And so then there was the question and the point of, okay, how do we distill this down into one chapter that's still coherent and still, readable? For me, I think this chapter kind of started with a bit of an exploration, I guess, of what athletes tend to use first of all during performance. And at the time of writing this, I guess I was really captured by some of the things I was reading about and the story we tell here is about what the All Blacks had learned to use and what the All Blacks were using during their kind of period of transition, if you like, between 2007 and sort of a number of Rugby World Cups where they really underperformed, and 2007 was the worst.
Yep.
I think it was 2011 to 2015 where they won both of those World Cups. And I was absolutely fascinated, and at the time I'd read Kerry Evans' book on Perform Under Pressure, and the metaphor they used. And I'm very conscious of a prior podcast here with Lisa Feldman Barrett, and so this metaphor that they used about red and blue, which I absolutely loved, and I kind of talk about this with some of my athletes. This idea of being in a red state where maybe we're not in a state to focus to perform at our best, or a blue state, which is more our kind of, if you like, our logical or sort of thinking state. And in that book, he sort of goes through a little bit about the strategies they might have used to switch in a high performance pressurized situation to perform at their best, if you like. So that was kind of one story that we start off telling in this chapter, and I guess from there some of the strategies kind of emerged about regulating or how we might regulate our emotions, from arousal reduction, simple breathing strategies, PMR, etc. To we talk a little bit about reappraisal in here, emotional expression versus emotional suppression, and again the advantages and disadvantages of some of those regulation strategies. So I guess that's how that sort of started, and some of the strategies kind of flowed from there.
It's such a simple metaphor, isn't it? Red head and blue head. And you mentioned Lisa Feldman Barrett, and for everybody listening in, it was a wonderful episode. Professor Feldman Barrett talks about the incorrect distinction that people tend to make between, let's say, the intelligent part of our brain and the emotional part of the brain. She says, well, look, that's just not the case. It doesn't exist. However, she, I know from the episode and from speaking with her, she appreciates metaphor and the importance of metaphor when it comes to learning and performance. And so, it feels contextually, Noel, that red head and blue head is a really useful way to think about managing emotions. And Scott, during a race, it can be so challenging to manage emotions as I don't know, athletes pass you or they're chasing you. It must be such an ongoing battle over those 26 miles if it's a marathon, or 66 kilometers or whatever it is over an ultra marathon or something. It's got to be a challenge.
Yeah, the best people I've talked to, they'll specifically talk about focusing on different sort of parts of their brain, basically. If you want to use the marathon, like for the first half, they're just like, I'm turning my brain off. I'm just following. They're not turning the brain off, but they're focusing just on, I'm going to get my drink at 5K. I'm going to get my drink at 10K. I'm all this sort of stuff.
Very task oriented, basically.
Yes, and then they remain task oriented in the second half, but the nature of those tasks become sort of more increasingly emotional, I guess.
Yes.
Up and so maybe with like 5K, like with 5K to go in the marathon, maybe then like I'm going to let it rip sort of emotionally. Whether they still can physically is a different matter, but that's when people top runners I've talked to, that's sort of been a common presentation of sort of this like gradual opening up of the sort of emotions that they know obviously felt in great amounts standing on the start line, but sort of holding it in for as long as possible, and then when it's really time, when it's safe, sort of then become these sort of more emotion driven than sort of coolly analytic about the situation.
I think that's fascinating, Scott, because as you're speaking now, I'm thinking of emotion as choice, utilizing emotion to high perform. I'm going to choose this emotion to enable me to kick on.
So here, the U.S. Olympic trials just concluded a few days ago, and there were several times where early in the race there was an incident, and Kara Goucher, who was she's a world championship medalist, she was a top marathoner. She was doing the commentary, and she was very good at so like in the prelims of the steeplechase, one of the top contenders, his spike got his heel was out of his spike, and he stopped for maybe 10 seconds to put his slip the heel back on the spike, and then he caught up and placed high enough to advance to the final. And she pointed out, this was one example. She pointed out like he at this time he cannot let his emotions get the best of him, right? He can't just like, okay, I got my shoe back on, I have to sprint as fast as I can to catch up to the pack. He needed, in that case, to remain analytical to make his way back to then qualify for the final. Whereas in the last 200, of course, that's when it would be safe to sort of like just go crazy in terms of, there's nothing to hold back. Like, let all the emotions out then. And she did a good job of repeatedly making the point to this lay audience about somebody got bumped in the first lap. She's like, she needs to remain calm. She can't let that get to her. Save it up for the last lap, sort of stuff. I thought that was a good job of explaining this sort of in real time.
That's such a great story. And coming back to you, Noel, as Scott was speaking there, it made me think of, and you addressed this actually in part 2 of the book, challenge and threat state, that in that moment an athlete has to get into or retain a challenge state when his shoe has come off, for crying out loud, rather than drop into a threat state where, perhaps those negative emotions are unhelpful in many ways to our performance.
Yeah, and it actually made me think of one of the stories we tell in the book as well about Michael Phelps, which I'll sort of maybe come back to in a second. But you're right, we talk a little bit about challenge and threats, which is, can I say that I'm a fan of a theory? It's kind of
well, I am. We've had 3 people on talking about challenge and threat, so go for it. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think as a theory that provides a framework for some work that somebody might do with an athlete in terms of areas that we might focus on, be it increasing perceptions of control, building self-efficacy, setting approach mastery oriented goals. For me, and in terms of then some of the outcomes associated with a challenge, threat, or a threat state, like one of the things I'm kind of thinking of when Scott was telling that story was, what we might focus on in that moment, things that what can I control right now in terms of my mental state, staying calm, staying focused, not going to a point where I just, with 3 laps to go in a race, I start sprinting as hard as I can and ultimately damaging my own performance and potentially my own outcome. But the story that I was kind of thinking of in terms of the Michael Phelps one, which I think sits really nice as well here, which again, increasing perceptions of control, was one that we tell about the 2008 Olympic Games. And I'm sure some people might have heard of this story before, but I'll sort of retell it briefly. In the 2008 Olympic Games, in the 200-meter butterfly, as Michael Phelps dove into the pool for that race, 200 meters, so it was 4 lengths of the pool. His goggles immediately started to fill with water. And for any swimmers that are listening, if your goggles start to fill as you're swimming and effectively you're swimming blind, you can't see the lane markers, you don't know the points where you have to turn in the pool. And I think if most of us were in that situation, what would we do? We'd panic, we'd maybe stop, we'd just, stop the race, I need to, change my goggles, whatever it might be. But the key bit of this story was two parts to it, really. One was prior to the Olympic Games, Phelps coach Bob Bowman believed that his athletes had to be prepared for any situation, for any scenario that might unfold in the pool. And he recounts a story in his book, The Golden Rules, of deliberately in one World Cup event stepping on Phelps' goggles without Phelps actually knowing. So that in this lesser race, when he did dive into the pool, the situation happened. His goggles started to fill with water. But what they'd practiced and how Phelps had planned to deal with any such scenario happening in a race was, instead of panicking, to remain calm. Again, we talked about focusing on process-oriented, task-oriented actions earlier on. He would start counting. And he knew that for him, it took 21 strokes for him to swim 1 length of the pool. So fast forward back to the Olympic Games again, when his goggles started to fill with water, he immediately started counting. And in the final length of that race, when his goggles were completely full, he couldn't see where he was. He couldn't see where his competitors were either. He started counting and 17, 18, 19, and as he reached 20, 21, he reached out for the wall. And ultimately won that race in a world record time, won the gold medal in a world record time. So Scott's story kind of reminded me of that, because those are situations that we can plan for in races. For an athlete in a track race, in a 1500 meters, 3K, 5K, whatever it might be, you might expect you're going to get bumped. You might expect that you're going to be, boxed in going around the final bend or whatever. And the planning is, how will I deal with that situation? And that planning and having a strategy to help deal with that situation, a strategy of what I'm going to do in that situation as an emotion regulation strategy, will help, I guess, to stay calm, to stay focused, to stay task oriented, rather than maybe thinking, oh, God, this is happening, what do I do now? And maybe go back into that kind of red head mode that we spoke about earlier on. So that's where my mind was going, actually, when I was hearing Scott tell that story as well.
Well, just, for Michael Phelps there, incredible clarity under pressure, incredible clarity when his head could have been filled with so many stressful thoughts and his body whirring away with anxious feelings. And clarity, focus, concentration, these are things that tend to go hand in hand. And the next chapter is about focus and concentration, and makes me think back to the episode we did together, Noel, last time, because I think the majority of what we discussed was around focus and concentration. And I'd like to reacquaint ourselves with some of the thought that we spoke about, some of the techniques we spoke about last time, which you talk about again in this chapter. But what really hits home, and I think you open up the chapter like this, is just people don't appreciate necessarily how much a drop in focus, even just for a few seconds, a drop in concentration, can actually influence the performance of a runner, the performance of any sports person, and then subsequently the outcome of the race. It really is a hinge factor, isn't it, Noel? Tell me a little bit about this chapter on focus and concentration.
Yeah, so I guess, maybe retelling some of the strategies here very briefly that we spoke about in the previous time. But this has really been what my PhD was all about, my research interests are all about. And the idea that, for high performing athletes, having strategies that help them to stay focused, maybe knowing what they'll say to themselves, maybe knowing how they'll deal with certain situations or events like the ones that we just described. Even if I become distracted during a race, one interview that I did with an Olympian, as part of one of the qualitative studies I did, the quote always sticks out in my mind. She spoke about in a cross-country race how a split-second drop in focus, she became distracted by a spectator while she was in the pack, towards the back of the leading pack, and that split-second loss of focus, she said it was all she could do to regain that focus, to reattach with the pack, and ultimately she finished second in that race. But without having the ability to regain her focus, to know what to say to herself. Part of her focus on that was literally latching on to like the jersey in front of her and just almost like the imaginary elastic cord
Yes.
staying attached for that split second, just allowed her to get her focus back, get back into the race. And that was one quote that really, I suppose, for me, emphasized how important a having these various strategies can be to regain performance. And then, as you mentioned, Dan, B, how something like distraction can be so harmful to performance, especially for athletes who are performing at such a high level. And I suppose one thing I should add on there as well, which we talk about in this chapter too, it can be very easy to interpret from that distraction is all bad, and that distraction doesn't have any uses. It absolutely does. Distraction can be very helpful, and can be an instrumental strategy that athletes maybe use to deal with other, deal with boredom or deal, get through longer training events, things like that, ultra events, etc. And so I suppose part of this, and a lot of my research I've looked at are thinking about, our metacognitions. And part of metacognition is something called contextual knowledge, this idea of that various strategies are useful at different times. And so knowing which strategy to use or what to focus on at various times, depending on the context, can be really important, I guess, for both performance and also maybe how we feel during activities as well.
Well, Scott, the book is brought to life through some really rich stories from your experiences from some of the athletes that you interviewed, and I know there were some, certainly one I remember, I can't remember who it was, who literally had to shout at him or herself to concentrate, focus. It must be a battle to retain that sense of focus, that sense of concentration throughout such a for such a long period of time, etc. And as Noel has alluded to there, or was mentioned there, distraction can be useful, used in an instrumental way, but building the capacity to stay focused for such a long period of time really is something so important. It's an important tool in the armory of a runner, isn't it?
It is. When you asked earlier about what was the sports psychology use of sports psychology 30 years ago or whatever, like this to me is a key area that I never heard about, nobody ever talked about. Of this, what are you going to think about when, and having these different types of focus as appropriate in a situation. So it's not so say somebody's a 2:05 marathoner, it's not like when the gun goes off, he's then for the next 2 hours and 5 minutes going, quick feet, good arms, quick feet, good arms, quick feet, take a drink, and so I think, Noel does a great job of explaining the uses of different techniques at different times, and how, when I started running, it was all about this: beginning runners dissociate, better runners associate. Yes. And then I always felt guilty when I would be out and just sort of looking at the birds and stuff, because I was trying to be a good runner, and I didn't know. Now I would feel better now, thinking oh no, I'm purposely distracting myself on this 2-hour run, sort of thing. This chapter to me is one of the things that I wish had been a lot more common knowledge 30 years ago, because I would have benefited greatly from knowing how to stay appropriately focused during longer races or whatever, instead of just chastising myself because my mind drifted. That's not really all that effective. It turned out.
Well, just for the benefit of the audience, both Noel and I got to see Scott pretending to run there in a very concentrated manner, just to when he was kind of pausing and when you were talking us through concentration techniques. There, it was a good example of concentration. And I think for the benefit of the audience, what I'd say to everybody is that if you're interested in some serious detail. I think we spoke for a good hour and a quarter, hour and a half now last time, and we got into some real detail around concentration, focus, and attention. Episode 85 of the Sports Psych Show is worth listening to. It's been one of the most popular episodes of the Sports Psych Show. Now, next chapter. We've got a couple more to go of part one. And the next one is self-talk. Everybody knows about self-talk, I think. No, but hey, it can be one of the most destructive things to performance. Tell us a little bit about self-talk.
I think this was probably one of the chapters we were most excited to write about and to talk about. And for me, with my research head on again, self-talk is probably, certainly in an endurance sport context, is probably one of the, if not the strategies, which or techniques which has the strongest evidence base behind it in terms of how motivational self-talk, for example, can help to improve performance and can help to optimize performance. So I suppose at the outset here, we talk a little bit about different types of self-talk. So kind of a rough run through, I suppose, some of the types that we talk about here. In terms of explaining the one I mentioned there, motivational self-talk. So motivational self-talk can be just very simple statements like, I can do this, I can keep going, this is tough, but I can push through this, etc. And what the research around self-talk, again in an endurance context, has shown is that very simple kind of interventions to help change our self-talk from a more negative form of self-talk or unhelpful form of self-talk, which may be more an automatic type of self-talk as well during tough endurance tasks, which are things like, wow, this is horrible, I can't do this, this is just really, really tough. One of the beginner runners that, again, I interviewed for a previous study, and she talks about how, in one of her first running events, it was really hard, it was really unpleasant, but her self-talk from those unpleasant sensations evolved into, I hate running, I hate this, why am I putting myself through this is horrible. So what the research, I guess, shows is that more motivational self-talk, what we explore in this book is how that more motivational self-talk can help to improve performance. And even how, not so much just what we say to ourselves, but even how we phrase that self-talk and how we speak to ourselves can be really important as well. One of the studies that we mentioned in this book, and again, there's research both in a sporting context, but also in a non-sporting context about this, is whether we speak to ourselves in the first person, so I can do this, I can push through this, or whether we speak to ourselves in the third person. So, you can do this, you can push through this. A really nice study that was published in the last couple of years showed that even if we're saying those motivational things to ourselves, whether we say it in the first or the third person can have an impact on our performance. And what that particular study showed was, I think it was in a 10K cycling time trial, that over 2 time trials, one in the first person and one in the third person, when people were repeating these statements to themselves, both tasks felt equally hard, but actually individuals perform better when speaking to themselves in the third person. You can do this, you can push through this, etc., by about 2.2%, I think, in that particular study. So collectively, I think what it shows is that, one, at a very fundamental level, what we say to ourselves is really important for performance, both in a sporting context and non-sporting as well. But even down to the subtleties of how we speak to ourselves and how we phrase that self-talk can have an impact on performance as well.
That's that first third person distinction, just for me on a personal level, was, I think, the most interesting thing I learned in writing this book with Noel. And it's funny because right around the time that we started talking about writing the book together, in I think it was September 2018, I sort of spontaneously said, "Hey, is there any research about calling yourself I versus you?" Because I think like I had done a hard workout that morning, and I struggled with it. And then like when I started saying like, no, when I started addressing myself as you in this workout, I like started doing better. And I think that Noel was like supervising or was a reviewer on this research, and you said basically like, well, there is some research I can't talk about right now. So I'm glad that we postponed, that we procrastinated long enough on the book that we could include it, because I think that stuff just, that to me, and like everybody, all my running friends who I've asked, like, so when you're doing a workout or a race, do you call yourself I or you? And most of them have to think, and they had to think about it, and basically the people who were better all said you, and the people who more often struggled had this sort of like, I can't do this, boy, I'm really suffering, why do I have to do this, and never learned how to turn it around to speak like a coach. Provide this sort of external assessment of the situation of like, no, you're doing great, you've only got this far to go, you can do this, you can do that to get toward your goal. And that to me on a personal level was just fascinating, that like just that little switch can have such a profound effect. I mean, I guess in the research world, 2.2% is nothing, but I mean, athletes will do anything to get 0.1%, so to get a 2.2% gain, that's, no matter what constitutes significance in a research study, that's significant in the real world, certainly.
Well, that's so well said. I mean, and that's the thing. It's the small things that make the difference. And as you were both speaking there, it just made me think of a conversation I had with Dr. Ethan Cross, who in episode 127, who is essentially a professor of controlling the conscious mind, if you like. And he's written this amazing book, Chatter, that he came on the show to talk about. And we talked about exactly the same things. Actually 2 points to make. And you spoke about the athlete, Noel, who started to focus on the pain and then started to talk to themselves in terms of, think about, why am I doing this? Why do I run, etc. And Ethan talked about zooming in and the power of potentially zooming out. And part of zooming out can be talking to yourself in the third person. You need to do this, and or actually using your name. Dan, keep going, keep working, keep moving. I think it falls neatly in line, although Ethan's book isn't specifically about sport. It sounds to me, Noel, that like Ethan's work very much goes hand in hand with the world of sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually cite some of his research in this chapter. And intriguingly, as an aside, Chatter was just delivered today. So I am looking for I am looking forward. I am looking forward to reading through it. We cite some of his studies just to give the context of how this applies outside of sport as well, and I'm sure he's gone into detail in the podcast. But what was absolutely fascinating, both in the athletic context and the non-athletic context, was this idea, and you used the phrase zooming out there, this idea of when we speak to ourselves, either in the third person, you, or calling ourselves by our name, we create this sense of distance, a psychological sense of distance between ourselves and maybe the emotion we're experiencing, or, for a runner, maybe the effort or the pain that we're experiencing. And that psychological distance seems to be what gives us the capacity to maybe regulate that emotion, or to, in endurance context, maybe deal with that discomfort or deal with that effort a little bit more to perform a little bit better. I suppose the kind of nuance there that's maybe worth mentioning as well is that we cite a study about endurance, and really this is maybe one example of research coming from outside the sporting context into the sporting context. So a lot of Ethan Cross's work is I suppose has influenced some of the research that's been done in sports psychology, and the specific study that we're talking about here. I think we have a lot more to learn in terms of how this might apply in sports psychology and in different contexts. Even regulating emotions during team sports, whatever it might be. But yeah, fascinating area of research and really, really interesting.
Great stuff. And finally, let's move on to the fifth chapter in part one. That slightly important mental skill of confidence. And you open up with the work of Albert Bandura, unsurprisingly. Noel, talk to us a little bit about this chapter, and feel free to talk about Albert Bandura and self-efficacy.
Yeah, so I guess you know, I think two things. One thing to maybe sort of start. So we kind of start off this chapter with that famous Muhammad Ali speech from the pre Rumble in the Jungle in 1974, and I mentioned that at the outset because the work of Bandura kind of comes from later in the 70s, the late 70s, when he wrote some of his similar work on, self-efficacy, sources of self-efficacy, etc. And what I find absolutely fascinating, and one of the reasons we kind of bring Muhammad Ali's speech into this, is that a lot of what he talks about in this speech, you can sort of link up with sources of self-efficacy. So he talks about, a previous victory that he had over Sonny Liston earlier in his career. So this idea of mastery experiences, and he also talks, but in the same breath, he says, I'm better now. And he talks about, okay, so we assume he maybe didn't wrestle with an alligator or anything like that, but he talks about his preparation before that famous Rumble in the Jungle fight with Sonny Liston. So I guess, in a way, perhaps I'm taking a bit of a leap here, but when we're talking about some of that speech, the speech, first of all, is so elegant, but there's so many aspects or sources of self-efficacy that you can pick from that speech. And again, links in nicely with the work of Albert Bandura in terms of sources of self-efficacy. So mastery experiences, what we say to ourselves, verbal persuasion, including our own self-talk. There's part of that speech where he sort of says, I'm fast. So this idea of interpreting our physiological state and how we might feel and how that can feed into our self-confidence, our self-efficacy, etc. So I guess in a nutshell, what we do in this chapter is we kind of discuss some of the work of Albert Bandura, broadly using the term self-confidence, but really sort of we're talking about self-efficacy here. The sources of self-efficacy, through the narrative and through the lens, I guess, of some of that Ali speech, and then maybe strategies and techniques that we can use to build self-efficacy and to build self-confidence.
But you're definitely going with, you don't reckon that Muhammad Ali wrestled with an alligator? Or was it a crocodile?
It was a crocodile.
Alligator. Scott, so I mean, look, you must have had so many conversations over the years with athletes about the importance of confidence. To close us today, what's your perception of confidence? What perhaps maybe can you regale us with a story around confidence, whether it's yourself or whether it's something a conversation you've had with an athlete, how important confidence was to them?
I would say, so if I'm going to keep it to running, I was fortunate enough to spend a month in Kenya several years ago, where in this one town where, on any given day there are 500 world-class runners training, and most of them had never raced outside the country, but every single one of them believed that they would be able to get outside Kenya, and that once they did, they would become the person who they saw in their, who they saw there in their village, who had gotten out, won races, come back, had won a life-changing amount of money, basically. And they all based it on like, well, who is he? He's from, I know this guy, he's from this town. I grew up in this town. I see him running every day. I can keep up with him. So if he can do it, why can't I? There's this incredible sense of self-confidence. We'll talk about mastery, but we also talk about like seeing other people's accomplishments.
Yes.
And to me, that was what was really striking, was it sort of like, well, I can do X, Y, Z that this person has done. So I can also then do this other thing that he's done. Because who is he? Who is he? And I've actually had this talk with, I don't know if I had it to this degree with Noel, but other people, I've like helped other people who are, experts in their field, but not primarily authors, write books. And there's always this like, well, who? I can't write a book. And it's like, who are these people writing books? They're just people, you know this stuff.
Yeah.
You know how, you can put a sentence, you can put one sentence after another, just explain what you know in the way that you would if I were talking to you. And for everybody, they're like, oh, wow, is that okay? That's easy. Not easy, but that's simple. So I think this is a case where the tools are really applicable to outside life. Both as sort of reminding yourself of what you have done and can do, but then also seeing, and maybe this is just my ego, but I'm always like, well, who is he? I'm as good as him. If he can do it, I can do it, sort of thing. And in running, this often stems from these people are in these big training groups, right? So if you're able to keep up with marathon world record holder Eliud Kipchoge 6 days out of 7, it's reasonable to think that you could, be almost as good as him in a race. So that I think the confidence stuff really applies so well to everyday life. I think once you sort of realize what it takes to gain that confidence, and that it's not like being, it's not bragging, it's not being egotistical, it's not being unrealistic. At least here in the States, there's a sort of a, if you're confident, you don't want to be too confident, right? Because then you're bragging, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about having a sense of what you can, like a sort of a motivating sense of what you can do.
Well, I love your analogy of writing books. I think it's perfect, and I think that it demonstrates the importance of bringing these tools and techniques together. Especially when you relate it to, let's say, finishing a race or writing a book. All these techniques come together. You set the goal
Mm-hmm.
of writing the book. You've got to focus and concentrate. You've certainly got to manage your emotions on the way. Having written a few books myself, I know that to be true. You've probably got to talk to yourself pretty positively at times, and you've got to utilize yourself to talk. And you want to probably write it with a bit of confidence, don't you? So I love that.
Yeah, you want to write the book like of course I'm the person to write this book.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not grounded in, and it's grounded in fact, and it's hard sometimes to realize that,
Yeah.
Noel, of course Noel should have written a book long ago.
Brilliant. Well, guys, look, what a fascinating conversation, and we haven't really dug in. We've taken a few stories from part 2 and a couple of ideas, but there's so much more rich content in part 2. A question to either of you, I don't mind, just to sell your part 2 to the audience, because we've certainly sold part 1. Everyone who's listening is going to buy this book. Sell that part 2 for us. What does part 2 look like?
I guess if I was to take a first go and summarize it, really what I really like about part 2 is just some of the athlete stories in there and how they relate to everyday life events. In to give a few quick examples of some of the people we've spoken about. There's the story about Steve Holman that runs through some of part 2, but how a lot of the skills that he learned as an athlete and learned through working with sports psychologists as an athlete, as Scott mentioned earlier, but how some of those techniques and some of those strategies he applied to life once he transitioned out of athletics and once he retired as a 1500-meter runner. So the stories like that. There's another story, and again, Scott mentioned about Kicking Randall, but again, it's how she used a lot of the strategies and techniques that she learned as an athlete to deal with the breast cancer diagnosis. Not that very long ago, I think, Scott, just a few years past, and actually just a few months after she won.
A few months after she won gold.
After in the 2018 Olympics. So I think there's stories like that show how these strategies can be helpful and can be useful in everyday life events across a whole range of different scenarios and contexts. So that's my attempt at summarizing part 2, and just a couple of stories that I think for me are certainly really memorable that run through part 2.
Yeah, I would just add to that by saying, it's sort of common in running to say, running doesn't make me a better person than you, but it makes me a better person than I otherwise would be. And I've long thought that a big part of that is when you apply the thinking that works well in running or other sports to everyday life, then that's an obvious way to then be more satisfied by and successful in the rest of your life. And that was really like one of the main goals in sort of writing this book from the start, was to show that I've been fortunate through my work for 30 years to have access to these people who, think in this way. And I always thought like I would hire them for whatever job. If I were in charge of hiring, I would hire these people for whatever job that is. And the second part of the book shows, so once you have these tools, then here are sort of common challenges en route to goals, whether those are sporting or non-sporting goals, and how to sort of, okay, in this situation, tools 1, 2, and 3B are your best, in the same way that if somebody comes to work on your house, they're choosing the best tool for the specific job. And that's what we try to do in part 2.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for taking us through the book. And the book is called The Genius of Athletes, What World-Class Competitors Know That Can Change Your Life. I'm assuming, gents, that it's available from usual channels?
It is, but hurry, because it's selling out so fast.
Brilliant. Okay. And in terms of, I know you will have sparked the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience in terms of this book. But yourselves, do you have social media? Can you be found on social media? Would you like to be found on social media?
So for me, Twitter is probably the best place to get me, and you'll see details on there as well. So my Twitter handle is at Noel Bricky, Brickie.
Yeah, so I think what is my Twitter? I think my Twitter is at ME Scott Douglas. But if you Google Scott Douglas running, you'll see more than anybody who has any reason to want to see. So that would show my Twitter and my personal site and my Runner's World author page and Amazon author page, things like that.
Well, I think you've given people lots of reason to Google you today, Scott. So thank you so much, gents. Thank you so much for that. Really enjoyed that conversation. Thanks for joining the Sports Psych Show today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Wow, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.